Welcome, one and all, to Impolite Company on the GCPR.live network, where we take that old adage, you've probably heard of it, where you're not supposed to talk about religion and politics in polite company, and flip that on its head because, frankly, it hasn't worked for society or the church very well, as we are in a very divided times. Well, anyway, so I'm your host, Matthew Best, here to walk with you in honest dialogue and showcase the power of seeing humanity, of people with different perspectives. So you can send your questions, your comments to contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. And you can find previous episodes on podcast platforms like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. You can find it on YouTube as well. Just search for Impolite Company. And you can dive further into any of the topics we talk about. I like to write, and so you can find that on my blog at pastormatthewbest.com. If you enjoy what we're doing and you want to support us, I'll put anything that you give right back into the show. It's buymeacoffee.com/impolite company. And then just a couple of things that I like to highlight. Some things that are near and dear to me is if you want to show some love to Christ Lutheran Church, the church that I am called to serve. It is in the heart of Allison Hill in Harrisburg, which is the most challenged section of Harrisburg, but a beautiful section as well. And what makes this church special is that we host 3 free health clinics that have served. We've had over 100,000 visits since 2018 from the health clinics and from a variety of other things. So you can go to christharrisburg.org. Care about homelessness? Check out the Memorial Blanket Project, where people make blankets from all over the place. We do a display on Homeless Remembrance Day, December 21st. Done it in a variety of places. This coming year, it's going to be in Colorado. We're actually getting off the East Coast, and we're going to do a display there and then distribute all the blankets. So you can go to memorialblanket.org. And lastly, looking for a tool to help you with a difficult discussion around gun violence, I would give you a book title, which is American Roulette. It's one of the books that it's a book that I came up with. There's 10 authors, and it's uh, a fictional account of a mass shooting where we don't offer any answers, but we want to highlight the humanity in a difficult conversation. So you can find that there. All right, so today I am pleased to be talking with Bob Irian, who is a colleague of mine. Bob is a Lutheran pastor, husband, dad, Navy veteran, and woodworker. That's quite a combination, Bob. And in recent years, his vocation as a parish pastor has increasingly led him into unexpected places as a public pastor on TikTok. He's been described as a passionate LGBTQIA plus accomplice, a caregiver for people wounded by the church, and an uncomfortable prophet calling the church to repent, along with a bunch of other less charitable things. Bob, welcome. Thank you so much for coming onto the show. I really appreciate you taking some time.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. So today, the reason why I had reached out to you was really to talk about that idea, that public pastor type of idea. Really kind of getting into these type of online platforms and forums, and I just want to take some time to really kind of dive into that. I'm on a few platforms, kind of mentioned a couple of them right there. You're definitely on a variety of some different things, and probably have a much bigger following. And so I want to start off with kind of a basic question for you: is what brought you to decide to go online, and start doing this?
Uh, I didn't decide.
Okay.
It kind of happened by accident. So, in December of 2020, um, my wife and my 2 teenage kids started nudging me to download TikTok.
Okay.
And I mean, my first thought was, I need another social media app like I need a hole in my head.
Yeah, right.
Um, and they just kind of kept on. And so finally I said, okay, fine. And I downloaded the app and I created a username. And I was trying to figure out what to do for a username, and my wife said, "Well, why don't you do something related to woodworking in case you ever decide to make any, woodworking videos?" And I like, okay, fine. So I picked a username based on that, Knothead 9620, and that was it, And I every couple of days I'd open up the app and take a look at what was there, and you know, not real interested in making any content or anything else. And then COVID happened, and like a lot of people, I was spending a lot of time at home during COVID. And one day in the spring of 2021, it was the day that I had actually been out of the house doing some ministry. I had been out doing some hospital visits uh, because at that point I was being allowed into the hospitals for people who were in critical care situations. And I came home, I had my collar on because I'd been to the hospital, and I opened up TikTok, and it happened to be March 31st, which is Transgender Day of
Mhm.
Visibility.
Right.
And so a lot of people were making content about that. And in the comments were a lot of really awful trolls
Right.
being transphobic and awful. Um, and that was not the first video I ever made, but I had made a few short clips here and there. But I saw that, and so I opened up the app and I just told a story about something that had happened to me a few years earlier. Actually, at that point, it was about 7 years earlier, where I got a phone call from one of the local funeral directors asking if I would do a funeral for a family. What in my mental shorthand, I call them public service funerals. It's usually
Hmm.
families
Yep.
that they have a faith background, but they don't have a church connection. And
Right.
so, like, they don't have clergy to call on. And at the time, I was serving in a town of about 30,000 people. And all of the local funeral directors knew me, and I knew them. And I and several of my colleagues, not just me, but several of us were folks that the funeral directors would call on if they didn't have any clergy for a service. And so this funeral director called me up and asked if I was available at a certain day and time for this service. And I said, yeah, sure, no problem. Let me put it in my calendar, and then you can give me the contact information for the family. He said, well, before you say yes to doing the service, I need to tell you a couple of things. And I said, okay. He said, well, the first thing I need to tell you is that the deceased was a transgender man. And I said, yeah, so what? He said, well, the other thing that I need to tell you is that he died by suicide. And I
Mm.
said, okay. And he said, well, I just wanted to make sure that, you knew that before you committed to doing the funeral. And I said, well, of
Yeah.
course I don't have a problem doing the funeral under those circumstances. He says, well, I felt like I needed to be upfront with you because the reason I'm calling you is his family's pastor refused to do the service
Wow.
because he was trans and because he died by suicide.
Oof.
Um, so obviously I was very committed to doing that service at that point. And
Yeah.
I went
Right.
ahead and I did the service, and I continued to care for that young man's mom and provide pastoral care for her and her family for years after.
Yeah.
But, you know, in March of 2021, I told that story in this TikTok video. And I said, if your theology tells you that you can't provide comfort to a family in the midst of their grief, because their deceased loved one was trans or because their deceased loved one died by suicide, then your theology is an abomination.
Yeah.
If your theology tells you that you need to hound a young man
Mm.
out of your church because he's trans, your theology is an abomination. Um, and if you would, deny the ministry of the church to a grieving family because of something like this, then your theology is an abomination.
Hmm.
And I close by saying, and to my, trans siblings in the world, um, please know that you matter, you are precious, and you are deeply and profoundly loved.
Yeah.
And that was it. And I hit, post and closed the app, and I didn't think about it again.
Yeah.
And the next morning I woke up And I thought the app was playing an April Fool's joke on me because it was now April 1st. And when I opened up the app, that video had already been seen 10,000 times.
Wow.
And I think there were already something like 800 comments on it, and it just kind of blew up and took off.
Wow.
And from there, like people started asking me things. People
Yeah.
started asking me about, well, what about this and what about that? And, I'm trans. What does God think about that? Or my kid just came out to me as non-binary. How do I,
Yeah.
love and support them as a person of faith and those kinds of things? And without really intending to or realizing it, I wound up becoming sort of a public pastor to a lot of people in the LGBTQIA plus community,
Yeah.
family members and loved ones, and just people in general who had been wounded and hurt by the church.
Mhm.
Many of them LGBTQIA plus, but many cis het people who had just
Yeah.
been beat up by the church. Um, and to be honest, there was a really steep learning curve for
Sure.
me. Um, because I come from a particular theological tradition. I'm a cradle Lutheran. I was baptized in a Lutheran church when I was 8 weeks old. It's really all I've ever known. Um, I've done some study in some other traditions, but I really was not conversant with conservative American evangelicalism as it exists in the 2020s at
Okay.
that point. And as I started hearing the stories of these people and the things that had been said to them, the things that they had been told, you know, um, wives being told to remain in the house with their physically abusive husbands,
Right.
like all of the theological horror stories, people who had been sent to conversion therapy because
Yeah.
their pastor had told their parents it was the only way to save their soul. Um, and I was just horrified by
Mm.
what I was hearing. And I was also horrified by how many people were saying, like when I would post something from our theological perspective, how many people were saying things like, why have I never heard this before?
Right.
You're the
Right.
first pastor who's ever told me I wasn't an abomination.
Yeah.
Where were you when I was in the church when I was a teenager and being, emotionally and spiritually abused? And what I took away from that is yes, the people who are preaching hate in the name of Jesus have an awful lot to answer for.
Sure.
And those of us who are not, but who are standing silently by and letting that happen have a lot to answer for too.
Sure.
Um, and those of us who, like I said, I'm a cradle Lutheran and I'm also a Lutheran by choice, and I love my church with all my heart, but it makes me crazy how terrible we are at public witness.
Oh
We are
yeah.
we are so bad at it,
Yeah.
so bad, and so afraid
Right.
to take a public stand on anything that the only voice people hear representing Jesus is a voice that looks a lot more like the people who drove the nails.
Yeah. Yeah. That it's reminding me, first of all, thanks for sharing that because that is extremely powerful as you just witnessed. Uh, and what you're talking about, especially at the end there, the fact that as a church we suck at proclamation in a variety of different ways. It's kind of like I've said, we're really good at funerals, but we're terrible at mourning. Um, like as far as an analogy goes. But it's reminding me of I just watched a video. It was talking about why we elect bad leaders. And this person who had done this video was talking about they brought in a little bit of Bonhoeffer's theory on stupidity as a part of this. But they were talking about the fact that the people that get elected have a lot of confidence. They're very confident and they offer a simple solution,
Mm-hmm.
and they can fix whatever the problem is, right? That type of thing. And the people who the rest of the folks are kind of like, well, it's complicated and there's a lot of uncertainty. And so like there's usually this kind of holding back. And so those are the people who usually don't get elected, although they would do far better with things. And I think there's some correlation probably um, with religious faith. And at the same time, I don't want that to be an excuse because we can get so caught up on, well, it is so very complex. Yeah, but there's some things that you can say that don't have to be complex that can get to the heart of what it is. Like what you were talking about of just like, hey, you're a valued person. That's plain and simple. Like you're a valued person, and we don't have to get into the complexities right off of a simple proclamation. Those can be other conversations and whatnot, but that simple proclamation, instead of getting lost in the weeds, is sometimes we just lose that. I think in what we're doing. Um, so I really appreciate what you're talking about in that.
Yeah, and I think part of it is that we get lost in the weeds. And we're trained, at least I was trained as a theologian, to be so careful
Right.
and so precise with language. And sometimes we can be so precise with language that we wind up not saying anything, or at
Yep.
least not saying anything intelligible.
Yep.
Um, and what I find is a lot of people they're open to nuance. They're open
Yeah.
to, you know, uh, deep dives into complex topics.
Yeah.
But we make the simple stuff complex.
Yeah.
Like, how hard is it to affirm the humanity and the human dignity of every human being? Like,
Right.
that's not hard. That's
Right.
not complex. You are a beloved child of God,
Yeah.
period.
Yep.
Like,
Yeah.
you
That's
know,
it.
and I also think we in our denomination have tried so hard to be the big tent where we don't
Yeah.
make anybody so uncomfortable that they have to leave, or we
Right.
try to keep everybody in the fold, that we wind up not taking a stand on the things that are the most important, and that does not help the oppressed.
Yeah. Right.
That kind of waffling only benefits the oppressor.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, this has been the debate of what the church, and you can see it on different online platforms of, well, that's being political. And when I hear that phrase, I often think that only comes up when somebody's not happy with whatever they're deeming the politics of something. Nobody ever says that when they're in agreement with whatever. It's an excuse to shut down conversation. And then usually it's threatened by, well, if you continue on this, we're going to leave, which means I'm taking my money and I'm taking my toys and I'm playing somewhere else. And
Go
oftentimes
in peace, serve the Lord, man.
right. And oftentimes it's like we're so worried about losing people that what about all the people that would come if, like, what about all of these other people that, we're so concerned with decline that has been going on since the 1940s. And that's measurable. You can see that decline has been going on since the 1940s. And we're thinking, oh, this is something new. It's been going on since the end of World War II. We're so concerned with decline, no, and we get stuck in that mode of this fear and the scarcity that it blinds us to the proclamation. It blinds us to, well, what is God up to? What is God doing? And sometimes people, how many times did Jesus upsets people? Because it's also trying to set them free, right?
Right.
And it gets lost.
And um, we want resurrection without a crucifixion.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
You
Big
know,
time.
and we forget that Jesus told us to take up our crosses, deny ourselves, and follow. And you know, you can't have it both ways, right?
Right.
If your church is going to be um, a safe place for gay and lesbian people, then it cannot be a safe place for homophobia.
Yeah.
If your church is going to be a safe place for trans and non-binary and gender non-conforming people, it cannot be a safe place for transphobia.
Yeah.
If your church is going to be a safe place for people of color, it cannot be a safe place for racism.
Right.
And we will tolerate all of those things in the interest of, well, everybody's welcome here. Yes, everyone is welcome here, but certain things and certain ideologies that are antithetical to the gospel of Jesus Christ are not welcome here.
Yeah. Yeah. This is where I remember talking with a congregation, and they were like, "Oh, we want to put out a sign that says all are welcome." And I said, "Do you? Are you sure? Do you know what you're talking about? Because let's say somebody shows up and they're a member of the Klan. Is that, are you going to welcome them? And what does that actually mean? What does it actually mean to welcome, that all are welcome?" And they're like, "Ooh, yeah, I hadn't thought about that." And well, that's a possibility, right? Just as anything else. And so be clear. This is kind of like what you were talking about. We got to be clear with our language and what the intention means, and not just the what's you know the most positive spin on something, but also, well, what's the reality of what does
Mm-hmm.
this actually mean in that?
Yeah.
Um,
And also, you know, when I got to my current call, there were signs all the way around. There's signs all the way around the building. They're still there now. They say, "You are welcome here." Yes, you.
mhm.
And we have, all are welcome here engraved in the glass over the main doors. Um, and when I'd been here about a year, I had members asking me, can we have a conversation about this congregation's stance towards LGBTQIA plus people? Because my kid is gay, my grandchild is
Mm.
trans, whatever. I mean, I had a dozen families that were asking if we could talk about this.
Yeah, yeah,
And the instant that kind of hit the streets, that we were going to try to have a loving, respectful, inclusive, open conversation and just decide,
yeah,
where do we stand on this as a congregation?
yeah.
As the minute that hit the streets, it became very clear that those signs were lying.
Mm.
Because at least on the part of a number of the people in leadership, no, everyone's not welcome here,
Yeah, yeah.
or they're welcome here if they are willing to deny everything about who they are.
Right, right.
Um,
Yeah. Well,
so
so yeah, I want to
go
share. We're going down a little bit of a different road, which is fine. That's all right. It's good stuff. But I want to get back to kind of the public, the platforms, the public pastor,
ahead.
um, and really kind of go into a little bit about, um, what are you're obviously reaching a lot of folks who have either had some kind of trauma from the church, or have had a negative, in some way, shape, or form, encounter with the church, and especially the things that you were talking about of, where were you? Why is this the first time that I'm hearing this? Um, what do you think? There's a couple things going through my mind, but what do you think would be helpful? And I don't want to get into, oh, let's do this program type of thing, because I don't think that's helpful. That's just, oh, we're gonna try something, and that. But in an authentic way, what would be helpful for the church with, you know with proclamation and utilizing these platforms in a way that can actually help with that proclamation? Does that question make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, we absolutely do not need a program,
Right.
um, you know, or a committee. God so loved the world that he did not send a committee.
Right.
Um, and so first of all, I think we need to be teaching leaders how to communicate like it's the 21st century.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, the model of proclamation that I was taught in seminary was entirely focused on me standing in a pulpit on Sunday morning,
Yep.
facing a bunch of people who are just sort of sitting there listening and absorbing.
Yeah.
Um, you could take an elective in like preaching with PowerPoint.
Hmm.
Um, and that was about the extent of any kind of tech preaching. And I remember that like there was a this sort of fad of anything that was new and different was like lifted up as the be all end all. And like
Sure.
there was a guy a year ahead of me who preached an entire sermon in rap,
Oh,
which I mean, in doesn't sound like that big a deal now, but in 2001 or two, that was like
yeah.
way outside the box for Lutherans.
Hmm.
Um, but I'm continually running into um, leaders in the church, pastors and bishops and synod staff members who almost pride themselves on being completely uninformed about social media.
Mm.
And like, okay, if social media is not your thing, that's fine. But in this day and age, like, I don't know how you communicate with the world without it. Not,
Yeah.
with the broader world, I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, it's kind of like so many of our churches were not live streaming worship until COVID made us.
Right.
And then all of a sudden we had to figure out how to do it in a flash. And even now, having been through COVID and having been through a period where the only way that we could gather as church was digitally, I'm still running into people who, look down their noses at digital community like it's not real community.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
You know, every Wednesday night and Sunday night, I do a live stream on TikTok. And on Wednesday night, we pray Compline together.
Hmm.
And then, and there's a place where I open it up for people to offer their prayer concerns, and I lift those up in prayer on behalf of the community. And when we finish the Compline service, then we sit and chat for an hour or until I get tired.
Yeah.
Um, and about whatever comes up. And that's when people ask their theological questions or their church questions, or they share their pain from the church. And,
Yeah.
we're able to do some pastoral care with that. And I say we because it's not just me, it's the community that has gathered that is caring for people
Yeah.
in that space. And, on Sunday night, we basically do the same thing except without the Compline service. And it's just, we call it soothing the Sunday scaries.
Okay.
Because I was hearing so many people talk about, having anxiety on Sunday evenings,
Mm.
looking at the week ahead.
Sure.
And we just get together and we talk about whatever people want to talk about.
Yeah.
Um, and, you know, I will tell you right now, I have had deeper and more profound and more Christ-centered conversations in that space on Wednesday night and Sunday night than I have ever heard in a church narthex.
Yeah.
Um, and with a handful of exceptions, deeper and more profound conversations and Christ-centered conversations than any I've ever heard at a church coffee hour.
Yeah.
We would never dare to claim that coffee hour or a potluck at church is not authentic community.
Right.
Why do we assume that just because people are connecting via electrons that it's not authentic community?
Right.
So I think that's part of what we need to do is we need to get over our snobby, snotty looking down our nose at
Yeah.
digital community.
Yeah.
Um, we need to stop giving ourselves easy answers about
Yeah.
why some churches are thriving and some are dying. Because I constantly hear, oh, well, these mega churches, they're thriving because
Oh,
they
right.
have simple theology. No, or they're thriving because, they just tell people what to think. Okay, how many adults do you know that like to be told what to
Right.
think?
Right.
I don't know any.
Right.
Um, but we um we denigrate all of that because then it gives us an excuse to not do it that way and not look at why those churches are growing and ours aren't,
Yeah.
right?
Right. Yeah.
And I'm not saying we need to go adopt their theology or even a lot of
Right.
their methods. I'm saying we need to be honest about what's going on,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
including the fact that we're continuing to communicate primarily by the same methods that were available to Martin Luther in 1530.
Right. Right.
Um,
Bob, this is bringing me to the question I want to the next kind of adjacent topic, which is AI. Right.
mhm,
This is something that the church isn't even coming close to talking about.
mhm,
And what I mean by that is there's some talk about AI as far as like, oh, what's the ethics around using AI to help with a sermon or, write a sermon or whatever the case may be, right? Those type of
mhm,
inside baseball type of things. But like we're talking about AI and the possibility of how it actually impacts society in real ways I was just listening to a colleague of mine sent me a video. Stephen Bartlett was interviewing a former executive of Google who was at the forefront of training robots in AI of how to pick up items and like the programming that goes into all that. And one day he came out and he realized like these were sentient, the way that he was defining it, in the sense that it wasn't programmed to do what it did, but it figured out how to do it and communicated with the other robots how
mhm,
to pick up a ball. And
mhm.
it was like watching my child figure out how to do that basic function, that type of thing, right? And they're talking about like, this was really interesting because he was talking about, this guy was saying, I'm not afraid of the robots coming and killing us. The problem that we have as a society is humanity and how it will use and abuse this technology. Right. And I think this relates very much with what we're talking about with these public platforms and use and abuse of of them. That they're a great tool, um, just like the printing press was. And there's potential for use and abuse of these in a way that shuts out so much good proclamation. It has the ability to do that because of algorithms and all this type of stuff. And I think as a church, we haven't even scratched the surface, and for a lot of places in the church, don't even have a concept that this is an issue and that it's happening right now, let alone something, whatever 20 years looks like from now, which is a whole lifetime in that.
Mhm.
And thoughts on AI and all that in relation to what we're talking about?
Um, I would tend to agree with what you were saying, that technology is a tool, right?
Yeah,
You know, yeah, a Craftsman tape measure and a pen sitting on my desk. These are tools.
yeah,
They're not good. They're not bad. They're not holy. They're not evil.
yeah,
The question is, what do I use them for?
right.
You know, I can use this pen to write a note to uh, a first time visitor from Sunday to say, "We're so glad you were with us, and please tell us if we can be of any service to you in the future." Or I can use this pen to write a note to the person down the street with a pride flag on the front of their house and say, "You are an abomination, and you will burn in hell with the rest of the sodomites."
Hmm.
That doesn't make the pen good or bad. It's just a pen.
Right, right,
And it's the same thing with AI. It's the same thing with all of these other tools. They can be put to good use or evil use. The question is, are we going to use this technology to share the gospel with people? Or are we going to continue to become increasingly irrelevant because we're speaking Greek to the Hebrews?
right,
In Acts chapter 17, Paul winds up in Athens because he can't keep his mouth shut. And every town that he wanders into in
right.
Macedonia, he winds up almost getting lynched. And so finally, like his supporters take him to Athens and they tell him basically, okay, Paul, sit here. We'll be back in a couple of days. Just stay here. Don't leave the house and keep your mouth shut. And
Hmm.
Paul, being Paul, of course, he can't do that. So he wanders
Uh,
around the city and he goes down to the Areopagus and he begins to preach this sermon, which sounds like an awful lot like all of the other sermons that Luke writes, because Luke was his
Uh-huh.
speechwriter in
Right.
the book of Acts. And, says, uh, I see how, very religious you are. And, I've seen all of these temples. And I even saw one with an altar that said to an unknown God. And I'm here to tell you that this God who you call unknown, I know him and his name is Jesus. And he proceeds to use that as like his
Right.
springboard to preach to the Athenians. And when I share that story with people, whether it's in my confirmation class or in adult studies or when I preach on it, I always say to people, the most important part about that story is something that's sort of assumed in the background that we don't even think about. And it's, what language do you think Paul was preaching in when he stood up to
Hmm.
preach that day?
Yeah.
Paul describes himself as a Pharisee, a Hebrew of the
Hmm.
Hebrews, circumcised on the eighth day, of the tribe of Benjamin, blah, 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 blah. But I guarantee you, when he stood up in the Areopagus to preach, he was not preaching in Hebrew, he was preaching in Greek.
Right.
And if there's one place where we continually shoot ourselves in the foot in terms of public proclamation, especially as Lutherans, it is that we are continually speaking Hebrew to the Greeks.
Hmm.
What I mean by that is, if there was one thing that Lutheran seminary pounded into my head, I don't know about anybody else, it was justification by grace through faith.
Hmm.
Like, whatever else you got wrong, if you got justification by grace through faith
Right.
right,
Yeah.
um, like there was hope for you. If you got that part wrong, you were toast.
Uh-huh.
And the article on which the church stands or falls. Okay, fine. Here's the problem, though. Martin Luther came to that answer because of the question that drove him. The question that drove Martin Luther was, how do I, a sinner, find justification before a righteous and angry God? I know very, very few people asking that question these days.
Yep.
I meet very, very, very few people outside the church asking that question these days, because we now live in a world where if like, I've had people say to me, in essence, well, if the only God you can tell me about is a righteous and angry God who, has a right to destroy me because of my sins,
Right.
I just don't believe in that God, and I have no reason to keep talking to you.
Yeah.
So I don't find anybody asking that question. I do find a lot of people asking the question of Ecclesiastes. What
Hmm.
does all of it mean?
Yep.
Hey, Pastor, I got I did what they told me to do. I got the degree and the advanced degree and the wife and the 2.3 kids and the dog and the station wagon and the big house in the suburbs, and I still feel empty inside. What does that mean?
Yeah.
Hey, Pastor, my husband of 25 years decided that he liked his, 24-year-old secretary better than me and served me with divorce papers. Where's the meaning in my life?
Yeah.
Hey, Pastor, my 19-year-old kid blew out her knee playing softball, and they the opioids that they gave her for pain medication post-op got her addicted, and now she's a heroin addict. And if she's still alive, I don't know where she is. Where's God in that?
Yeah.
You know, those are the questions that I like. I've had people ask me those questions. I've never had somebody say to me, how do I find justification before a righteous and angry God? And if
Oh
the
yeah.
only answer we have is justification by grace through faith, it's a great answer. It is a beautiful answer. It's one of the reasons I am a Lutheran, but it is not the answer to the question that people are asking. And if you answer a question that they're not asking, when they come to you with the tenderest pains of their life and you give them an answer to a question they didn't ask, they are going to turn their back and walk away, and rightly so, because you deserve it.
Yeah, because you didn't listen. And I think this also gets into, there's the rehearsed answer, and then there's the, well, what does this actually mean? Which is a good Lutheran question, right? Well, what does this
Right.
actually mean? So you can take, I've talked with a couple of authors that frame justification in the sense of, how can you use justification, the sense of justification and the belief and the theology around it, to deal with these polarized times. And so their approach was saying, look, it's not your belief about abortion, your pro or against or whatever that makes you a Christian. And it's getting away from kind of like these all these issues that come out. But it's because we're part of God's family. And like, and this is so they were taking something, that kind of basic answer, and saying, well, hey, this is the question that you're asking, is, where do I have to stand on this issue or this issue? And it's like, no, that's not what, if that's what you're going to do, it's going to constantly be changing, and it's going to be constantly up for debate. And it's going to be exhausting. And where is the good news in that?
Right.
Instead,
And
you know,
we have an answer to questions about meaning and
right,
purpose in life,
right, right.
and we have an answer to these really deep questions that people are asking, and but we're so bad at communicating that. And
Yeah.
you know,
So how do we turn that around, Bob? I mean, again, to me, it's got to be authentic. It can't be this forced type of thing. I don't hear you saying, "Oh, everybody else ought to get on TikTok and all this type of stuff," because if
no.
that's not, like, I'm not going to get on TikTok, and I'm on plenty of different things and all that, and like you said, another one, right? But I'm aware of it, and like, I've got kids that are 16 to 22, and so they keep me in the loop on this, which is really helpful and whatnot. And so I'm finding out, what are people talking about, coming from the folks who utilize that. um what are they talking about, and how do I need to think about these things? And then, like, there's my congregational setting, which is very different, and it's a diverse congregation, and a lot of poverty. All, yeah, they have different concerns, and so that's where I'm tapped into, and all that. So yeah, so the question is, what are some things that you think we can do as a church, in an authentic way, to improve? I hear you talking about the idea of proclamation.
So I think we need to spend a lot more time training leaders as public theologians,
Yeah,
and in the art of public proclamation, via whatever medium that is, right? Like,
yeah,
again, the medium is a tool. TikTok
yeah,
is a tool, letter to the editor in the local paper is a tool, the printing press is a tool, right?
right,
Whatever tool makes sense in your context. Not everything is a hammer, or not everything is a
right,
nail, so we need to give
right.
people more than just a hammer, right? um so we need to be teaching particularly rostered leaders in the church how to do this kind of public witness
Yeah,
in whatever way is authentic and makes sense for them. And if you're an off the charts introvert, I get it. I believe it or not, I test as an introvert myself,
hmm,
but that doesn't change the fact that part of my call as a pastor is to be a public proclaimer of the gospel.
right,
We also so desperately need to train bishops in how to do this,
yeah,
because they set the example. And when bishops step out there and take the lead and set the example, it gives the first call pastor, 18 months into their first parish, the cover and the courage to do this, even when it's going to be unpopular with somebody in the congregation.
yeah,
And we throw these kids out into these parishes and we say, go be a public proclaimer of the
mm,
gospel, but we don't step up and back them up, right?
yeah, yeah,
And we need to get better at teaching congregations to understand, yes, this is part of your pastor's call, is to
yeah,
be a public
yeah,
proclaimer of the gospel. And that means they may go places that you don't agree with. They may say things that you don't agree with. They may show up on the 11 o'clock news at an event that you would rather your pastor wasn't at, but that's their job. And oh, by the way, yeah, that's going to be part of the time that they spend, quote, at work every week too,
right,
because their job is not to take care of you every minute of every day. Their job is to proclaim the gospel
right,
and to assist you in doing that. So, for instance, you know, I got invited when I'd been here in Lancaster a little over a year. I got invited to come to a trans rights rally in front of the county courthouse on a Saturday afternoon. And
hmm,
because I was asked, I showed up in my collar.
sure, yeah,
I didn't know there were going to be news cameras there, but there were. And, on the 11 o'clock news, in the background of a shot, as they were interviewing the organizer in the background, you could see me go by in my collar.
Sure.
And, the next morning at Sunday morning worship, as I'm shaking hands at the door, I had a couple of people ask me about it.
Yeah.
I hadn't even watched the 11 o'clock news, so I didn't know that I was on the news. And I did have some people asking the council president and other folks, well, why was the pastor at a trans rights rally? And thankfully, one of the lay leaders in the congregation said, because it's his job.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
Um, but we need to be getting folks to understand that, you know, when I show up to a trans rights rally at the Capitol, I'm not doing that because it's my politics. I'm doing that because it's my theology.
Yeah.
I'm doing
Yeah.
that because safe schools for trans kids is a gospel issue. You
Yeah.
know, whatever you believe about being transgender, whatever you believe about whether, transgender people, whatever you believe about that, as a Christian, I don't think there's any other valid belief beyond, or that doesn't include, I should say, they are beloved children of God.
Yeah.
You know, they're a human being created in the image of God. Whatever else you might think about being trans or gay or lesbian or, having two big toes on your right foot or whatever, right? Whatever else you might believe, if they are a living, breathing human being, they are a beloved child of God. And therefore, their rights and their dignity should matter to us as church.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and so, like, going back to an example from way back at the beginning, when you mentioned, if you put up on your sign, everyone is welcome here, and a Klansman shows up, well, yeah, a Klansman is welcome here.
Hmm.
Um, and I would, if a known Klansman walked through the door of my church on a Sunday morning, I would say, welcome, I'm glad you're here. Um, that does not mean I would give them the
There
pulpit
you
to
go.
spew white supremacy from,
Yeah.
but I would say you are a beloved child of God and there is a place for you here.
Yeah. Yeah. And well, and it there's also a lot of complications with it too, because it could mean something very, like how do you deal with this for folks who are, people of color, like unknown, right? That's getting into a side type of thing. But
Right. And
when you're talking about this, it's reminding me too, like I think I would add on one of the things of for bishops doing this as well, not only the leadership aspect, but they have a platform that individual pastors do not usually have access to.
absolutely.
And I think there's an important aspect of that can be used. Now, the question becomes, well, how often and all this other type of stuff, right? Because then but at the same time, that's not an excuse again to not do this. The office itself offers a platform that is not available to a whole lot of other folks in
Right.
that.
And as leaders, bishops need to learn to use that platform.
Yeah.
First of all, they need to learn that, yes, you can step onto that platform and use it, and they need to learn how.
Oh
There
yeah.
was a
Big
story that,
time.
Mark Hansen, when he was presiding bishop, told this story because during the run up to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he was, in addition to uh, presiding bishop of the ELCA, he was the chair of the Lutheran World Federation at the
Right.
time. And the Lutheran World Federation issued a statement calling for restraint in the mad dash to
Yep.
war in Iraq. And he told the story of being called up for an interview with a reporter. And he went and he sat down with a reporter and they put the microphone on him and it got the camera set up and whatever. And the reporter asked the first question and he proceeded to give a very learned and
Yeah.
carefully nuanced answer about just war theory. And he happened to look over and notice that the red light wasn't on the camera. So he stopped and he said, is there something wrong with the camera or what? And the reporter said, no, the camera is fine, but you got to give me 1 to 2 sentences. You got to
Yep.
keep it short. Like I can't have a 3 minute
Yep.
answer to every question. And his response was, well, as Lutherans, we don't do theology in sound bites.
Oh.
To which the reporter responded, well, then we can't use you for this interview.
Ooh, ouch.
And and when he told that story at a
Yeah.
church-wide assembly, he told it like, let's pat ourselves on the back as
Ooh.
Lutherans that we don't
Oh
do
no.
theology in sound bites. And I'm sitting there thinking, you had a golden
Right.
opportunity to say that, there
Yeah.
is a faith position other than let's go bomb the infidels. And you blew it
Wow.
because you couldn't figure out how to communicate in one or two sentences.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, how many times is Jesus quoted in scripture, except for John, who would not
Right,
get the interview.
right.
But like Mark, any of the other synoptic gospels has Jesus for the most part, not always, but for the most part has sound bites. I mean, this is not anything new. One of the other things I want to go back to too was I remember hearing this at the Festival of Homiletics. It was Otis Moss III, great preacher. Oh my gosh, love, uh, like he's just talking about proclamation, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he talked about the idea of, you know, if you're going to do online type of things, you can learn those things and that's fine, but let the digital natives do the technology and you can do the theology and all that. But it's kind of this combination of like don't try to force it into, if you're not good at doing a TikTok video like me. I'm not going to do TikTok videos because I just don't have it in me and the time and all the other stuff going on, which is fine, right? But if I were going to do it, I would probably want to tap into one of my kids or somebody who like this is more native and it just kind of and I don't need to know how the functioning of it works, right? I need to know like, hey, I flip a switch on and the light comes on. I don't need to know how electricity works. I know
And I'll tell
somebody
you,
that knows how to do that.
right.
And that type of thing. And I think there's also a lot of value in that, in the sense of, this is the church that's always talking about, um, how do we get the young people and all this type of stuff? Well, are we tapping into people and what their gifts are and what they're skilled at and what they know? What's their first language? Um, like this is an essential part of it. We don't have to do it all. This gets into the whole idea of does the pastor have to do it all, right? And we kind of have talked a little hit on this a little bit, really rethinking what does it mean to be church and how do we be church in this time, in this age, versus how it was. Not that what it was bad or anything like that. It's just it doesn't fit the times anymore. There's things have changed, and so this is I don't want to get into this other topic, but the idea of how do we mourn so that we can be fully present and go towards where Jesus is calling us to go. Um, so anyway, we got like 5 minutes left. So Bob, throw some good news at us when it comes to utilizing these type of platforms. I know you talked a little bit about this, some really good positive encounters for folks, and it really is the proclamation of good news. People are being set free from the things that have been harming them in some way. And so I just, for a couple minutes, can you just give people some good news when it comes to where this has really been very positive impact?
Yeah. A number of places. The first piece of good news is you don't have to know much, right? You got to love Jesus and love his people. But beyond that, I mean, everything I know about the functionality of TikTok, I
Yeah,
could fit on a half of an 8.5 by 11 sheet. I am so dumb when it comes to algorithms and functionality and all of
yeah,
that stuff, right? Um, I don't know how to manipulate the algorithm at all, right? Um, you don't have to. You just got to be willing to speak gospel for people.
yeah,
I think the other piece of good news is people are starving to death to hear gospel.
yeah,
And if they hear it from you, like the joy and the opening that that creates for people is just unbelievable. And I'll tell you, there are days like, so I talked a little while ago about compliment and conversation on Wednesdays and soothing the
Yeah.
Sunday scaries on Sundays. And, there's times when at 8:45 on a Wednesday night, the last thing I want to do is go down to my office and open up my live stream and, lead a worship service. But I've learned that I make myself go do it because at the end of it, I feel restored. Like I feel fed. Like this has been the most reinvigorating experience of ministry I've ever had because I get to literally watch people's lives change.
Yeah.
Um, and other good news is there are people who are not Christian and will never be Christian and yet are not hostile to the gospel,
Right.
right? Like I have people who come and volunteer at our Thursday night community gathering meal who first became acquainted with Redeemer's existence because they saw me on TikTok, probably
Hmm.
doing something stupid. Um, but they hung around and they listened and they appreciated it. And, when I talked about us feeding people on a Thursday night, hey, if you show up at 5:30, you're going to leave hungry, no questions, or you're going to leave filled, no
Right.
questions asked. You show up hungry, you'll leave full.
Yeah.
And, there's one of these guys who comes every single week and helps with that meal. He works
Hmm.
Sunday mornings. He will never ever be in our pews on a Sunday
Right.
morning until he retires, if
Right.
then. But
Yeah.
he does not miss a Thursday night. You know, when we thought we were going to go bankrupt as a congregation, 9 months ago, I mentioned in a TikTok, hey, a lot of you have talked about how inspired you are by the ministry that we do here, and that if you believe in it and you're able and you're willing and could give us a little bit of a hand, we would appreciate it. And if you could just pray for us or think nice thoughts about us, that would help. We had over 100 people, not members of the congregation, make donations to the congregation over $5,000 in the space of 4 months.
Wow.
Um, and like that didn't turn the tide to keep us from going bankrupt, but it sure helped. And
Yeah,
that's not
sure.
why we did it. That's not why I talk about
Right.
Redeemer on TikTok. And it's certainly not why we do anything else we do. But these are people, many of them have said, I will never cross the threshold of a church again.
Yep.
But you guys are doing something that matters there, and I want to support that.
Yeah.
You know, and the other good news is, like you don't have to have it all figured out. You don't have to agree with everybody about everything. You don't even. Some days I don't even agree with myself about some things. But if you've got the nerve to stand up in some public space, whether it's online or in a coffee shop or wherever else, and speak the good news of a God who is so in love with humanity that he thought we were worth dying for,
Hmm.
if you're willing to even do that, the Holy Spirit will do things that will blow your hair off your head. I mean, I have seen the Holy Spirit do things that just knock my socks off doing
Yeah.
this. Um, and it's definitely not about me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
I'm just a bozo with a smartphone,
Yeah. I
and a big
hear,
mouth.
I hear, and a lot of that is that willingness to stand up and say something. And, as pastors is what we do every week. Get up and we say something, and we hope that it's what God wants us to say.
Right.
And we hope that it makes a connection with people, that offers them a sense of hope. It gives them a sense of grace and a sense of relief. So,
And I
so
think the thing, just real quick, the
yeah,
thing
yeah.
that transmits or communicates that sense of hope and grace is the degree to which we stand with the people who are being crucified and the people who
Absolutely.
are being oppressed. And I've said many times, if we claim to stand with a group of people,
Mhm.
and we're not close enough to get hit by the rocks that are being thrown at them,
Yep.
then we're not standing close enough to them.
Absolutely. Yep.
And, you know, so many people, yeah, I get lots of feel goods in the comments on
Yeah.
TikTok, but I also get
Sure.
people telling me that I'm an abomination and I should be
Oh
beaten
yeah.
to death with a baseball bat. Like that's
Yep.
a direct quote.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but just the fact, the way I look at it is if they're saying that to me, that's 15 seconds that they're not saying it to some 14-year-old kid
Yep.
who's just trying to figure out who they are.
Yep.
So yeah, that standing with the oppressed means standing between them and the oppressor. And yeah, we might get a bloody nose or worse,
Yep.
but that's kind of our job.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
we believe in
Yep.
resurrection.
That's right. That's right. You got to go through death to get to resurrection. Well, Bob, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fabulous conversation. If people want to find you online, how would they do that?
If you go to TikTok and you just search for at Knothead 9620, KNOTHEAD 9620. And I'm on a couple of other platforms with the same username, but the reality is I never even open those, or well, I open them to see what's going on in the world. I don't post a
Yeah.
ton of content in those
Yeah.
places. Because again, I barely know how to post on TikTok. But
Yeah.
um, so yeah, that's where you can find me.
Okay, perfect. Well, thanks again. I do appreciate you coming on. And for everyone else, I hope you all have a wonderful day and we will talk to you soon.
Thanks for the opportunity.